All right, I'm going to kick us off. So glad you're here with me tonight. My name's Liberty, and I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective. This evening, you're going to be hearing from Black Coal and Red Bandanas author Raymond Tyler and illustrator Summer McClinton, alongside Shaun Slifer and Kenzie Walker of the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum. So just a little obligatory background on my bookstore. Firestorm is a 16-year-old radical bookstore owned and operated by a queer feminist collective in southern Appalachia on the land of the Cherokee people. And we love to feature books and events that reflect our interests and the needs of marginalized communities in the South in particular. We're continuing to do a number of events online, both because it's awesome to be able to collaborate with authors and speakers at a distance, and also because we know that COVID and other health concerns continue to pose a barrier for a lot of folks in our community for in-person gathering. Coming up in March, I just want to give a shout out to a few events on prison abolition, the history of Jewish anarchism, and radical relationship making. So check out our website for details on those, and I'll drop a link in the chat in just a minute here. So speaking of the chat, we're on Zoom. There is an open chat that you should definitely feel free to use. The panelists may or may not be able to engage with the chat as we go through tonight, but if you've got questions for them, it would be awesome if you wanted to put those in the Q&A. Probably at the bottom of your screen, there's a button for both chat and Q&A. If you put them in the Q&A, then hopefully we won't lose track of them. And when we get to the end of the event, we'll try and circle back and pull some questions from the audience. So thanks so much. Would love to hear from you. All right, we're going to get started. And I'm just going to share a few quick bios for the folks who are speaking tonight. Raymond Tyler is a comics writer from Appalachian, Georgia, currently residing in Nyack, New York. He's a longtime social justice and labor activist, bringing history from below and bridging that into comics. Raymond's most recent work is the horror comic series Amputation Capital. Summer McClinton is a painter and comic book artist based in the Bronx. She's illustrated 12 books, including the Zarek Award-winning Thread, Michael Damon's Masks of Anarchy, and Harvey Picar's Huntington, West Virginia on the Fly. She's an award-winning painter, illustrator, and art director whose comic work tends to favor notable historic figures engaged in the ongoing fight for social justice. Thanks so much for being here, Raymond and Summer. We've also got with us Kenzie Walker, who's worked as the executive director of the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum since 2018, where she's led several community-based projects dedicated to uplifting the people and preserving the places of Central Appalachia. Kenzie was the project coordinator for the Battle of Blair Mountain Centennial in 2021 and shepherds the museum's fundraising efforts to secure resources and regional support to fuel the museum's ongoing work. She's the proud daughter, granddaughter, and great-granddaughter of union coal miners. Thanks for being here, Kenzie. And last but not least, we've got Shaun Slifer, who works as the creative director, designing and building all West Virginia Mine Wars Museum's exhibitions, grounded in the collective vision of the museum team. Shaun is the lead designer on the museum's community-based Courage in the Hollers public monument project, and currently serves as the ad hoc collections manager, cataloging artifacts and developing online. What's that? Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Oh, you're all right. Shaun is a founding member of the Just Seeds Artist Cooperative and an original member of the now disbanded Howling Mob Society. His investigative People's History book, So Much to Be Angry About, Appalachian Movement Press and DIY Radical Publishing, 1969 to 79, is available from West Virginia University Press. Shaun, really appreciate you being here tonight. And I just want to say how incredibly cool it is that we even have a West Virginia Mine Wars Museum. I actually didn't know that the museum existed until recently, and I'm so excited to visit. and really excited to hear from all of y'all tonight about both this title and the museum itself. So I'm going to pass off to Raymond to give us an intro to the book.
Sure. Thank you so much, Liberty. My name is Raymond. I got to write this. I had to write this comic with some cool people. I'll just tell y'all just a little bit about the book before I pass it over to Shaun to talk about the museum. But this comic is about the West Virginia Mine Wars, of course, which is a protracted multiracial union uprising. The book starts in 1901, and we follow the characters Mother Jones, Frank Keeney, Dan Chain, and Bill Blizzard. Those are just to name a few, until we end the book in 1921. The book was written by myself, as I said before, with the editing help of Paul Buell and drawn by Summer McClinton. And this book was published by both PM Press and Working Class History. And yeah, that's about it.
Awesome. All right. We got a short slideshow for you all. Okay. Kenzie, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, happy to. So, as Liberty said, I work as the museum's executive director, and I've been in this role for a little over 6 years. And yeah, the fact that the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum, there is a museum dedicated to this story, I think is really special. Um, the museum exists as like this grassroots community effort to preserve um, this very specific history that is totally relevant to a national audience and even a global one. I grew up in the coal fields of West Virginia. So I grew up in a small holler called Cub Creek. It's in Wyoming County that sits right in between the Mingo County, McDowell County line. Um, all of which was very important for the story that is told through this comic and also told through the museum itself. Um, and yeah, coal mining was huge in my family and still is. Like I still have my father-in-law who works underground as well as my brother-in-law. So it's still something that we see a lot in the region, but we don't see a lot of union activity. So I grew up about 40 minutes outside of Matewan, and a lot of people in this area grow up without knowing these stories or having heard of them. Whenever I was, Shaun and I were chatting this morning to strategize about this event, and there's not really a singular moment in which I can remember learning about the West Virginia Mine Wars. It's just something that like I was almost born into, and it was something that's just existed with me. Um, for a really long time. And so the fact that the museum is here in this place is really special because I think it's a point of pride for people that grow up in this region, but also helps shift the narrative around what is a union. Because again, a lot of folks, graduate and go through school and even have their first jobs or have their careers without really understanding what that is. And so the museum is a place where folks get to discover that. And we're right here in Matewan, West Virginia. Here's a picture of the town. This is the whole thing. So a lot of people don't live downtown, but instead live in a lot of the surrounding hollers and bottoms. But yeah, I'll pass it over to Shaun to talk a little bit more about where the museum's at and what we do.
Yeah, so the town of Matewan, the first time I ever heard about the West Virginia Mine Wars was actually from picking up the movie Matewan at a DVD rental store when those still existed. Really kind of randomly. I mean, me and my partner at the time didn't really know what to watch, and she picked this movie out, and I was like, I don't know, it looks kind of depressing, but let's check it out. And so we watched this movie, and then I subsequently read a book about the Battle of Blair Mountain and was really captivated by it. Um, and at that time, I lived in Pittsburgh. I grew up in Central Tennessee, but I've been in Pittsburgh for about 20 years. So all of this had happened really close um, to where I was living in a city that had a much more robust and visual labor history to it than I was used to growing up in the Southeast. So this is the town of Matewan in the top corner here in 1920, and then present day. The movie itself is probably one of the first times that, like, Battle of Blair Mountain happened in 1921, and we'll sort of make all this make sense over the course of the next hour. But prior to the mid 1980s, nobody had really written much about it, about the mine wars at all. There's a number of reasons for that that we can get into, but this movie really kind of came out of nowhere, I think, for a lot of people who didn't grow up in the region. And it tells a story of a particular period in the mine wars. It's also covered in Black Coal and Red Bandanas, of a shootout. One of the things that we struggle with in the museum has to do, and I think it was interesting to watch how Summer and Raymond dealt with this in their book, is the fact that a lot of the people that are in the stories that we tell were not in any way famous people, and many of them were not photographed in their time or really represented artistically in the way that, US presidents are or whatever. So, for example, in the movie Matewan, James Earl Jones plays a character named Dan Chain, who is also known as Few Clothes Johnson. In our museum, we have one photo of Dan Chain, and it's the only one that we know that exists. And it is, in fact, a mugshot. And so Black activists in the United Mine Workers were already very seldom photographed. The United Mine Workers is pretty progressive in terms of actually being one of the first unions in the US to hire Black field workers, like field organizers for organizing the union. And Dan is sort of famous in our circles, but there's one photo of him that exists. So it was interesting to me to see how Summer and Raymond started to pull these characters out of a type of visual obscurity that we as people who work with primary documents in the museum sort of struggle with. One of the forces that continues to abrade against the reality of people who live in the coal fields during the mine wars era is a private security firm called the Baldwin Felts Detectives. They weren't really detectives. They were known locally as gun thugs. These are basically the guys that the coal companies hired to keep people from unionizing and to keep people from doing anything that was out of line. They were basically private police. A lot of towns did have police forces, but a lot of towns just had these private coal guards. The picture at the top, there aren't a lot of really good photos of these guys. So the picture at the top is actually from the Matewan movie. There's a couple of artifacts that we have and a page from the comic. I always like to point out we have this Baldwin Felts badge that says secret agent on it. And I don't actually know if you were a secret agent who you would show your badge to, because you're supposed to be secret. So I don't really know what sort of situation that badge existed in. But these guys were actually, to back up, I'll say, like, this eviction scene that you're seeing in the comic here, if you were a coal miner in a private coal town, you would come into that town to get a job mining. You and your family would live in a company owned house that was built around a mine owned by that company. You live in their housing and you shop at a store owned by that company. That's the entire circle that you live within. You are paid for your labor in privately minted company scrip, which is only valuable, which you can only exchange at the company store. So if the company sets a rule that you cannot unionize with the United Mine Workers and you break that rule, you're immediately evicted from company housing. And you can't even take your company script that you've earned from your job to another town because there's not any good at the company store in that town. So one of the things that made Matewan interesting is that it was an independent town. It wasn't originally founded by a coal company and it wasn't run by a coal company. But people would end up in these tent cities these colonies, usually on private land or sometimes just along a riverbed, that where they just threw up tents that the Union would provide, and sometimes live in these for upwards of a year or two while the Union tried to organize, and sometimes eventually just move on to other communities. The Battle of Matewan, otherwise known as the Matewan Massacre, is this kind of amazing shootout that happened in the middle of the town that our museum is in. This guy in the middle here, Sid Hatfield, is the only police officer that I'm going to suggest anybody celebrate. He was very pro-union, and he was basically organized a ambush of Baldwin Felts detective agents after they evicted a bunch of people from their homes in 1920. So this is one of the first times in a long series of sort of militant actions in the coal fields that somebody in a position of authority actually stood up to the private security guards. If you flash forward a year later, Sid Hatfield is assassinated for a number of reasons that are actually quite complex, and we can tease these out. Thousands of miners end up marching from the nearby the capital of the state of West Virginia in Charleston. They start marching south for a number of reasons towards Logan County, and then towards the county seat of Mingo County, which is Williamson. They don't get there. They clash with a force at a 13-mile ridge line called Spruce Fork Ridge, of which Blair Mountain is the southernmost point. And that's where the Battle of Blair Mountain happens, which is one of the largest armed battles on American soil since our Civil War. And this was national news at the time, which is what makes it kind of wild that nobody, that it's a story that a lot of people didn't get taught about since then. It isn't even in Howard Zinn's amazing People's History of the United States. I don't know why, but it isn't in that book. So that's the march route. Very rare photo. And again, here, I was really fascinated to see how Summer and Raymond pulled together imagery of the Battle of Blair Mountain, because there were not photographers running around the battlefield taking photos of what was happening at that time. There were a few newspaper photographers. Earlier in the mine wars, some of the socialist newspapers had photographers that traveled down there and documented it, but not so much during the Battle of Blair Mountain. And the miners didn't want, security culture, right? They didn't want newspaper photographers coming around and taking photos of everything that they were doing because of what they were doing. So these guys, and I know Summer's going to talk a little bit later about her process, pulled together some illustrations based on some sense of imagination and some sense of the costuming of what might have actually happened at the time, which was, for example, that a lot of the people who fought in the battle showed up in some of their U.S. Army gear from World War I that they had just gotten back from, with these kind of doughboy helmets on and whatnot. And then I'm just going to kind of breeze through what the museum is. And Kenzie, you can interrupt me if you have anything you want to point out. This is our 10-year anniversary. We started 10 years ago in a small storefront in downtown. I would say it's downtown Matewan, in the middle of the town of Matewan. And then we moved across the street into this building, which is old Matewan National Bank, when the Union local, UMWA Local 1440, purchased this building in 2019. And then throughout the course of 2020, as we were reeling from the first year of the pandemic, we were rebuilding inside the bottom floor and front half of this building to recreate the museum at about 3 times the size of the original one. If you had asked me 10 years ago if the museum was still going to exist in a decade and have expanded and have all the kind of support we have, I would have, I would have hoped for that. But at the time, we really had no idea how far we would be able to get. It's difficult to overestimate the amount of power that coal companies still have over what the narrative in the region is, not just the history, but present day, over politics in the region. So I felt when we first started this institution like it was kind of an insurgent institution in a way, because we weren't asking anybody for permission. We weren't allied with any kind of state institutions or fundraising. I mean, it was really just, as Kenzie said, a grassroots effort to preserve this story. And from my perspective, to start a museum that like didn't have to ask anyone whether it needed to exist. In fact, like what museums are a method of storytelling in the same way that a graphic novel is or a history book. It's a physical space that you walk through, and it has a type of legitimacy to it that people just kind of assume. And yet, like, the legitimacy that we were asking for was, trust us because we're from this area and we know this history. We are maybe one of the only museums in the country that I know of that has worked directly with a labor union since day one, and has had on our board retired coal miners as well as academics, as well as artists and community teachers, community members, whatnot. So we have a lot of stuff. We have a lot of objects. We have some reproductions, and we walk you through the Mine Wars era chronologically, from explaining what coal company towns are, through the Paint Creek and Cabin Creek strikes, which are in Black Coal and Red Bandanas, through the Battle of Matewan or Matewan Massacre, this is a new exhibit where you can actually look out the only window. When we renovated, we covered all the windows because I like a dark museum where I can control the light, but we left this one window open at the suggestion of a community member who said, you can look out this window and see where the Battle of Matewan happened. So as you're walking through the museum, you come to this window and you can actually listen to a narrative of the battle and look out on, present day and see like four-wheelers driving by and pickup trucks and stuff where the shootout happened. And we have quite a bit of archaeological finds from the battlefield itself. I'm actually going to skip forward and then I'll come back to that red bandana, which is clutch. There's a man named Kenny King who's from the region who has been working in the coal industry his whole life, but he also kind of taught himself vernacular archaeology, people's archaeology. He's been walking around the Battle of Blair Mountain battlefields since the mid 1990s, pulling up anything that he can find and just giving it out to institutions to hopefully have it put on display. And we were one of the first organizations to come across. And basically, to put it frankly, I think it's about 3/4 of our collection is stuff that Kenny has found, and some of which he's bought on eBay. And a lot of that stuff that then gets into our exhibits actually comes from his sort of shoe leather archaeological work, which sometimes involves trespass. So I think that's another interesting piece of the story, is that in many ways we've had to actually go and physically take back the evidence of these events from the soil that's now owned by coal companies in order to build this museum. I promise I'm not going to be the only one talking tonight, but getting towards the end here, we talk about red bandanas. The book is called Black Coal and Red Bandanas. The red bandana, actually, Kenzie, do you want to tell this story? I feel like maybe I'll take a breath, and am I putting you on the spot? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Do
All
you want
right.
me to tell the story of how we got it?
Yeah, and why red bandanas are significant.
Yeah. So the red bandana during the Battle of Blair Mountain was a marker of identity. So the miners who marched and fought for Union recognition were called redneck. Um, and this isn't the origin of the term, but it definitely helped popularize it, and it reached a wider audience. And there was a lot of sort of propaganda that was happening during this time with the Bolshevik Revolution and the fact of calling these folks rednecks. And so miners, there's a lot of folklore around this piece of cloth too. I've heard several different stories about how did they get access to this, and as Shaun was talking about the way in which company towns were constructed, from my understanding, these bandanas were available at company stores. So miners would use them underground to either wipe sweat or to wrap around wounds. So in 1921, everyone who fought on the miners' side had a red bandana on their person. So the going uniform at the time was either their blue jean overalls or World War One uniform and a red bandana. And it really was, especially at this time, interesting to see who was wearing it because about half of the army were, white mountaineers, people that were born in West Virginia or surrounding area. Um, a quarter of them were African American workers who were recruited from the Deep South, and a quarter were European immigrants who were recruited from Ellis Island. And so all of these folks wore bandanas for this is really like the Shaun said this came in clutch. This is like the holy grail of the museum now to have an original 1921 bandana. We only know of two that exist. So there's this one, and then there's another one that's at the State Museum. Shaun and I, one of our big projects is something called Courage in the Hollers, and we're trying to build, monuments to this history, which we can talk a little bit more about. But we came into contact with someone through this project that it took a couple of years to build a relationship with this person. And when he came to the museum for the first time, he brought this bandana with him. And he was really moved. It was a very special day. He was really moved by what he saw, and he loaned it to us. And then once he came and saw it on display, he then gifted it to the museum to have and display forever, which is really special. So yeah, here it is. It was Shaun just built this case within the past few months. So this is like super new and really excited to have it.
Yeah, I think it's kind of wild that something so commonplace like a bandana that you blow your nose on would then become 100 years later the holy grail for a for a museum, but such is the case, right? Um, this is some other archaeological stuff that Kenny has picked up. This is an old Winchester that was probably hidden after the battle. A lot of miners hid their weapons when they went home so that they could go back and get them later, and this one was never recovered. So it was just sort of rotting a couple inches under the soil before he found it. Um, and we have about 900 distinct items in our collection now, and only I think about a seventh of that is on display. So we have an incredibly um, dense collection of not just Kenny's archaeological stuff, but also objects like that red bandana that had been brought to us as we've started to become an institution that people are interested in, like trusting their family heirlooms and other things that are important to them with. So I remember a decade ago, some of our board members saying, I really want the museum to become like a research facility that people can come visit. And I was just thinking, like, I don't even know if we're going to be able to keep the lights on for a couple of years, let alone become a research facility. But here we are. We actually have an archive room with all of this stuff in it, and we're poised to be able to loan out objects to other museums, as well as be a place that you can come and see this stuff for yourself. So we've got more ammunition casings than we can put on exhibit because they tend to survive in the soil. These are all 30 caliber shells from the battlefield from one particular dig. And so some of that stuff, because a lot of it is currently in storage, but all of it is photographed and cataloged, we've used to create different themed online exhibits. So not everybody can visit Matewan. It takes a lot to get there. You got to really try. But in the meantime, in the interests of attempting to not gatekeep this history as much as possible, we've created some online exhibits where you can at least see the objects and, email us, ask us about them. We're constantly helping teachers and students with like imagery and info for their research and for their projects. So check us out on the internet, but please come and visit us in Matewan at any time. I always tell people the longer you wait to visit the museum, like don't wait too long, but the longer you wait, the better it'll get because we're constantly improving.
Thanks.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Shaun. I'm gonna move into asking Raymond and Summer some questions. And the first question that I always like to ask anyone that I meet that knows about the Mind Wars is, how did you learn about this? Because it's like one of these hidden histories, unfortunately, that people have to discover. So, Raymond, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Funny enough, my wife jokes that from the first time we met, I wouldn't shut up about this event. As far as when I first found out about it, um, my I've always been interested in working class and union history. After I found out when I was a kid, my father was a union steel mill worker in Gadsden, Alabama. And he used to have like night terrors from when he worked in the steel mill, right? And for some reason that was just became something that was a special interest. I grew up in Hall County, Georgia, Northeast Georgia. Even though I live in Nyack, I'm from Georgia. I'm the only one in my family who's not born in Alabama. Just a little bit of a side story. But the thing about Hall County is that it's it's a very industrial place. I was beside a place, Gainesville, which is like it's the chicken capital of the world, right? And so there's all these chicken plants, right, everywhere. So I think that it came from an like a mixture of just being very interested in working class history. And then I was a teenager and I loved going to watch movies. Like I loved going to the video store. I loved going to the comic book store. Those were my two places that if I had any money, I'd go there. I saw the movie Matewan. I don't even know when. I was a teenager when I first saw the movie Matewan. And that captured my imagination immediately. I was just like, this is one of the coolest things I've ever heard. Um, and from there, it was a special interest. Uh, we would also, even though I grew up in North Georgia, we drove through West Virginia all the time and would stop in West Virginia pretty regularly, because my grandfather lived in Pennsylvania. And so we would go through West Virginia. And on top of the interest in Matewan, it is, I think, probably one of the most beautiful places. I I I would live there in a heartbeat, just because of how gorgeous it is. And so that definitely added to like the love of the story. And that was how I initially found out about the event. But it wasn't until I went to college. I'm sorry, I'm being really long-winded on this answer. I apologize. I went to college in Vermont, and I went to college for writing in Vermont, and at a place called Goddard. It's kind of like a radical little school. And there was a teacher who told me to, that maybe I should explore like being Appalachian and like, that sort of culture, write about that sort of stuff. It was years and years later that I took that advice to directly write about that stuff, but I ended up reading a good bit about the West Virginia mine wars and other union struggles in the Southeast, right? And especially in Appalachia. So that's just the basis.
I learned about this story from Raymond, who came to me with Paul Buell, and they had this story, or Raymond had this story that he wanted to tell. And that was my first knowing about the story. I thought it was amazing, and I couldn't believe that it was unknown. And my own work tends to go towards like radical leftist type stories, just because that's what I like. And I had worked on some things with Paul that were, related. So I thought it was really cool. And I was also really drawn to the Mother Jones character in the story. She's like this super radical, loudmouth, much older woman, which I thought was like an amazing character to have in any book because it's just such an underrepresented archetype in not just in books, but just also in our culture. So I thought it was the coolest thing to have the combination of this untold story, obviously extremely relevant to tons of people, but just to the larger audience, invisible, and then also have this opportunity to showcase a character in that way. So that was my introduction to it.
Thanks, guys. And yeah, Raymond, don't worry, we can talk. We got time to talk. That's what it's for. I'm curious how both of you got into comics to begin with, and how you, not just how you got into them, but why you're still into them, like how you see them as a mode of storytelling, why that really stuck with you.
Summer, you want to go first on this one?
Okay. So I was not somebody that grew up with comics. I think I thought they were fine, but one second. You can eat whenever you want. Just go eat. Sorry, I have terrible Zoom etiquette. But anyway, I was obsessively drawing all the time, and I really wanted to have an outlet for drawing that made sense because my work is narrative. And so I got into comics. A friend of mine and I drew a comic called Thread about this girl who lives in Flatbush, Brooklyn, and she falls in love with this guy who was like a drug dealer who's doing security at a pharmaceutical company. So we had sort of anti-capitalist, like stick it to the man leanings from back then. And then we won an award with that. And then I started working with other writers after that, doing pretty much like all like lefty stuff. I did like SDS, largely because of Paul Buell, who was putting together these books, but the Students for Democratic Society. And I was also working with Harvey Pekar, who was one of my big heroes in the comic space. And I did a couple long form novels with him. And then he and I did a book called The Unrepentant Marxist, which is like a 150-page comic book, but is not published by anyone. So that's like a secret story, I guess, in its own way. And yeah, I just keep doing stuff but I feel like I'm forgetting what the question was in the beginning. How did I get into comics and why am I still doing comics? I'm trying to get better. I feel like I'm always trying to improve at storytelling, and I think the medium is really interesting. I love how it partners with writing in this way that's immersive, and what you were saying about a museum being like a way that you can immerse yourself with objects and be in the experience is kind of like what I try to do with comics, and like kind of look at that as like, if you can really engage the reader in a moment that feels, they're having like a visceral reaction or they're having an emotional response, then it's like you're really inside that. And I also think comics are a form that is perhaps like more relevant in some ways to what we're doing now in terms of how we process information, if that makes sense. I think a lot of stuff is much more visual. And I have an 11-year-old son, and he can burn through graphic novels, but he's not super interested in books a lot. So it's, to my mind, I feel like that speaks to the fact that the way that we think and the way that we interact and the way that we process and share information is always evolving. And so to me, that's just a space it feels interesting. So yeah, I think I was on topic there.
Absolutely. For myself, I got into comics. I don't remember a time not being into comics. I was around them pretty much since the time that I can remember. Um, as far as the first time that I went to a comic shop when I was a kid because I had two older brothers and they were into some sort of card game. And my mom got me a comic when I was like, to shut me up in the store. Worked great. I read that. I got that book, got that comic, and I couldn't, I was at the age of learning to read, and I would just look at it all day and all night, like with like, the other comics that I had collected from like newspapers and that sort of stuff. And what was funny is kind of through comics, I learned how to read, and it was like a funny thing of like I would always tell my parents that I was reading these comics, and they're like, "No, you're not. You're not reading them. You're looking at the pictures." And then they take the book, like, "What did this say?" And then I would be able to kind of, tell them like what the story was about, the best that a kid could. And at that point, they were actually pretty like happy that I had read this book. They thought I was pretty doing pretty well as far as reading was going. So they would just kept buying me comics, and I loved them. I never put them down. I would get so excited about the newspaper and the funnies. I loved the funnies so much. Like I would just like anytime my dad had the newspaper out, I'd go over and I'd get the funnies from him. It was a I was a teenager. Sorry, I wasn't not a teenager. I was in fifth grade. I was like 11 years old, I guess, 11, 12. I don't remember what age fifth grade is exactly. But like I
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
So like I went to the comic shop, and I just finished reading like this big thick graphic novel, right? And I was looking for something else to read. And this kind of older guy with a beard was like, "Oh, you should read this guy named Alan Moore." I was like, "I don't know who Alan Moore is. I don't know who the writers are. I just know that these characters punch things and I think it's cool." Right. And the long story short, I'm way too young to read this book that he gives me. I get this book, I take it home, or I go home, I read like the first 20 pages of it, and it's really dark, and I keep waiting for the good guys to show up. I get to a very certain part in this particular book, and I shut the book and I put it under my bed, and I'm like, I'm not reading this again. This is dark. I don't like it.
Was
Like
it from hell?
no, it was a Watchmen. When I was it was Watchmen. So I put it under, and I was like, I'm never looking at this book again. Right? I was way too young to read this. Right? Then I end up the next morning I end up getting the book out, of course, and reading the rest of it, and getting to the end of the book, and going, where's the rest of this book? Right? It can't end like this. There's no good guys. There's nothing happy that was happening in it. And I go to the comic shop and I'm like, where's the rest of the book? Like, is there another whatever? He's like, no, that's how the book ends. Uh, I didn't know what I had read. I really didn't. Like, I was confused, which ended up, I went on to the internet because this is I had the luxury of growing up in a time where I could just go and Google things. So I went and, started to look up a little bit about the book and what it's about. After I find out there's no sequel to this book, this is just how the book ends, then I start to, do a little bit of research on my own. And I started to read about like the person who had written the book, right? And I had found out that the person who had written the book was a self-proclaimed anarchist. No idea what that word, right? But was interested in this and then in this book and started looking at what the book's about. And then I read it again. Then I read it again. Then I read it again. I read that book so many times um, until like, sixth, seventh grade. But that book ruined superheroes for me. And I hated reading superheroes after it. Like I really didn't like superhero books after that book because it was so I was like a jaded 12-year-old, I don't know, from reading this book. But I started reading all of his other work. But then, when you don't read superheroes and comics, what else is there to gravitate towards? It's kind of alternative comics. So I started to get into the first nonfiction comic book I would have read when I was younger would have been Mouse, right? I read Mouse. Um, eventually I read, I started just like getting into more and more stuff. I read Joe Sacco's Palestine at some point in time. I don't actually remember. I could have been a little bit older by the time I got to that book, to Joe Sacco's Palestine, but that was a very influential book on me. I don't remember what the exact age was that I read that book, but I also started to get into underground comics, like the reprints, and there was a website at the time you could go and look at old like underground comics pages. Don't remember what the website is. I would doubt that it's still around. And that stuff was really fascinating to me, like the alternative side of comics and the political side of comics. So um, I ended up going to school for creative writing and studying social justice. The first thing that I ever did, the first job I ever had in comics, the book that's mentioned before, the amputation capital book, that was a genre comic book that I had written with a UK company. That was the first thing I was ever able to get published. Was this like genre horror comic book. And I ended up sending a message to Paul Buell, who's the editor, because I had read a lot of his other comics works. He did a book called Red Rosa, that I loved, that Kate Evans did. He did, which is about Rosa Luxemburg. He did a book with Summer. You were with the SDS book, and I read that book. I love that book. So
And
you,
you read the beats too.
yeah, right, and the beats, and y'all worked with Harvey Pekar, who later in life became my favorite comic writer.
Mm.
Just in general. At some point in time, I got a hold of a collection of black and white American Splendor. I think I was freshman in high school by the time I started reading American Splendor in some sort of way. I think that the movie would have been out by then too, when I was a freshman in high school. I'm not sure of the exact timeline, but that opened my eyes to alternative comics, what comics could be. And then on top of like for the political side of things, I've been politically active for like, involved in, radical politics in any sort of way that I possibly could be, you know, um, it's like 18 when I started hanging around in that, in those circles doing doing like mutual aid stuff. I think I also found a lot of my way to, political comics too, like punk rock music and, uh, and heavy music, that sort of stuff. So like, that was always a part of the background that would then lead to this sort of trajectory to like alternative comics like Black Coal and Red Bandanas. And yeah, that's, why I'm still doing comics.
Yeah,
That's
that's
an
right.
Yeah, that's an awesome trajectory. Summer, I have a question specifically for you.
Mhm.
And Shaun talked about this a little bit during the presentation, but a lot of the stories and the people of the mine wars, we don't have photographs of them. And so it looks like in the book you pulled together a ton of different imagery from scratch or from imagination. Could you talk a little bit about what that process is like?
Sure. I use like thousands of reference photos, so that's probably obvious. But um, it was funny that you guys had that Dan chain up because I saw that photo too. And one of the things that I do sometimes is he reminds me of the actor. I wrote his name down because I never remember the whole thing. Keegan Michael Key from Key and Peele. I don't know if you know Key and Peele. Um, so if I have somebody that I think kind of looks like somebody, it can be really helpful if that person's an actor, particularly. Sometimes I use like musicians, but to build a character with stills from that person's acting because they will have different poses of themselves doing things. So this is just a screenshot of one of my bridge folders. This is for the um, pool scene, which I don't think I have another thing for, but this is just, I guess, to show how when I have a page, when I get a script page that I'm blocking out for the comic, I will do the research to figure out like what places look like back then. If it was a pool hall from 1920s, what did it look like? What did people dress like? How did they hang out in that space? And then sometimes I'll use specific poses that are set up. Again, movies do that well, in terms of like a lot of the angles and things are already composed in a way that's beautiful, so it's easy to sort of set that up with the correct backgrounds. And then I think in the not this frame, maybe the next one. Yeah. So another thing that I thought you were asking, but I realized now was not what you were asking. But a lot of times the thing about history and drawing history is that people look the same through time. That's one thing that I've noticed, is that like faces repeat like through eras, like you can see people that are from like much different time frames, but they have similar characteristics to now. And then the other thing that I think repeats is, the like people that, like, if I'm drawing a historical story, the people that are in the story that I'm trying to evoke are not aware that they're making history. They are just like, they are not actively creating this history that we all know about and we have this context around. They're just people that are living really earnestly and really intensely. And so I try to just pick up on that part of it, that, the fact that stuff repeats. There's a lot of classic things. And then, so for example, like something like this, I would do searches. This is for the mine collapsing scene. So I'm looking at images of horses and mules, but primarily horses because it was harder to find mules, and what their faces look like when they are upset. And then the mine scene, there's also like, it's children who are doing the mining. So they're in the mine and the mine's collapsing. So I did a search for, there's across like all kinds of stuff. Like sometimes it's people are actually in danger, like these kids that are running are like, there's some kind of war situation happening in the first image. And then the other one is these kids are just like getting scared by their parents, I think. Or sometimes they're just extremely excited, and like excitement also translates sometimes as fear. So this next frame, that guy, the one that's this series up here is these kids that are in a haunted house. And the one that I've got the red bar around is the one that I actually used as the pose for the kid that was having the explosion. Anyway, this is getting a little bit off the historical topic, but that's the guy. So you see the horse and then the kid, he's going like this, so it's like he's freaking out. Like, so that's the thing that I'm trying to get across, is the being really scared. And that happens under lots of different contexts. But if you can isolate that feeling and put it in the place, and then you can source the correct, to your point, clothing, environment, the historical part of it, then you put it together and it's a story that happened at a time, but it's like, it's anybody's story. You would be terrified if it was you in that scenario and that was happening. So I think that's okay. And then here is a view of like a physical setup that I did on some of them. So this is like photo references that are put together, and then I base the drawings on those. So I think the only one that's really like what I was just talking about is the guy who's got he's like hurt his knee in basketball or something, and then it translates to something else. And then there's like, I think that's Denzel Washington, maybe in the bottom frame. Anyway, so that's how I put together the historical bits. And in terms of like the research of it, there's just so much available on the internet now. If you know how to research it, it's it's really amazing, like the source material that's accessible. So Dan Chain, yeah, I tried to make him look like that guy in that way. So I don't know, did that answer the process question? But that's really to me one of the most fun parts of doing historical graphic novels is just like you learn so much, like it's like a huge education. And then, like I said, it's also an education in the fact that, yeah, this thing happened like a long time ago, but it's still like extremely relevant in the sense that like a lot of people are living extremely intense situations right now, So it's what we need to talk about, I guess.
I'm curious so I was thinking a little bit about what Raymond said about superhero comics because we talk in the I feel like our museum is like kind of we try really hard not to celebrate certain heroes. However, there are these characters like Mother Jones or like Sid Hatfield who sort of rise to the top and kind of become these sort of people's heroes. But all of that is connected to union activity, which is inherently collectivist and about, everybody sort of working together for the common good. So I'm curious if you guys could talk just a little bit, and then I think soon we should see if there's some audience Q&A. But I'm curious if you guys could talk a little bit about what you think is important about focusing on unions now.
Yeah. Um, so for this comic, when I was first writing it, we were actually coming off of I was a part of, and I'm not trying to overplay my part in a very, very small part in New York of people who were doing solidarity stuff with Bessemer, Alabama, Amazon union that was trying to organize investment. And for those of y'all who know much about the way that ended, they unfortunately they didn't get the union investment at this time, and there was a lot of feelings of because the group that I was with was it was a coalition group of people who were doing things called the Workers Assembly Against Racism, WAR, right? WAAR. And they were doing some good stuff and putting on solidarity events in Union Square. We marched to Jeff Bezos's apartment in the city, and it was a very energized time for the Bessemer, for Bessemer, Alabama, hoping that they would get this labor union. When that didn't happen, there was a lot of workers and people who were involved in the movement and people in Alabama, of course, who were disheartened, which would be understandable. And I started to write this story after that event, after the union did not come to fruition in Bessemer, Alabama. And the thing that I was looking for when I was writing this, as I said, this was a special interest before, but I was like, it takes a lot to get a union. It takes a lot of struggling to get a union. And people really put their best foot forward with the Bessemer, Alabama union. And there was a lot of concessions that were given. And that's there's something of a victory in that struggle, and so then that kind of caused to sit down and write the story. But in general, when I think about like labor in a comic, I think a general tendency in popular fiction or even in history is to denigrate working people. Oftentimes, I think workers are portrayed as like poor, downtrodden people with no agency and autonomy over their own lives. I mean, at least this seems to be the case, what you might call ruling class ideology, like fiction and history. But if there's one thing the comics medium has historically been good at, it's that portraying people in a heroic light. To to me, as strange as it sounds, the closest thing I'll probably ever get to writing a superhero comic would be this book. Just because I'm not very interested in superheroes. Um, you know, though there's like a complicated characters in the book, um, you might note that there's somewhat of an intentional like superhero trope that is played into, but in a collective way. I'm not talking about like in an individual sort of like way. I'm talking about in a collective way, which I don't think that could be achieved unless it was in the pages of a comic. I think if it was in a movie or like a long form documentary, it might not come out as well, right? With a comic, we get to zoom out, we get to see a mass movement of people, then we get to zoom in, right, to the individuals, then we get to zoom back out, and like that constant, and we get to play with what perspective they're in. We get to portray the actions of people who are struggling for the everyday, struggling for workers' emancipation and workers' rights and workers' liberation, in a very positive way. So I don't want to pretend that the book would be like an objective, like far off view of the West Virginia mine wars. I hope people read it and are inspired to like do everyday acts of heroism, things like joining maybe a union, maybe the IWW, getting involved with like a local mutual aid group, supporting workers, and fighting against these horrible things that keep coming down the pipeline, with the right-wing administration. So I mean, that's kind of the hope, is that people take the book. You're probably not going to be Superman, but you could join the IWW. You could join a union. You could fucking, yeah, I'm so sorry. Sorry. You could, I'm sorry, man. I didn't mean to say that. You could, you could join a mutual aid group.
Yeah, I think it is. I think you nailed it when you said that, like, the working class are portrayed as less than, and that's complete nonsense. And this country can't function without them. And it's like this majority, fiction and media view of those people either being invisible or incidental is just nonsense, really. And it's the artist's prerogative to tell the truth, and that's true. That, like, that's, we're taking away the undocumented workers, and like, good luck to us. It's just, there's a lot of anyway, we're talking about unions, and unions are this way that people are able to have a voice and be collective, and to act collectively. And the book treats the subject of unions in a very nuanced way. I think it's not all one view of how it is, and unions are nuanced, but it's really important that there is some heroic light thrown in the direction of collective action, because it is really something that's always accessible, and we are conditioned to think that it's not, and that we are separate from each other, when actually we are much more connected to each other than we realize. And there's this, I think maybe what Raymond was referring to in terms of like the heroic light or whatever, is like, this Mother Jones gives these like giant fiery speeches to these people, and she's like, her thing is to like get everybody all riled up, and she's like, there's more of us than there are of them. Like, that concept, I think, is just really important to remember, is that the unequal distribution of power is really a lot of emperor's clothes going on, and so we have to keep reminding each other that this is like a lot of nonsense. So that's, I think the union is something that is symbolic of that, and in the best case is empowering, so that's what I'd say about the unions.
Summer, since you brought her up, I see a question in the chat that is about the story of Mother Jones,
Mhm.
and someone is curious about expanding upon her story and learning more.
Expanding on her story apart beyond, like after you've read the Black Coal Red Bandanas story. So this is okay, because yeah, the implication here is that I've done lots of research on Mother Jones. Um, she's I have. I have not like sat down and read any books about her. So it would be hard for me to recommend like what to read about her. There is like you can read her speeches online. There's a good amount of her speeches. She was a public figure, so it's a lot of her stuff is recorded. I'm not sure. Do you know, Raymond? Is there like a biography about her? Or...
Yeah, there's some good ones. Jenny Savage Ayers wrote a great book about Mother Jones that we used several times when we were talking about this. I think this person might be asking if we would ever write more about, like, maybe maybe even give her her own book one day. There's not a plan for it, but that's a cool idea. That's a great idea. There's not a plan right now, but Mother Jones is certainly a character you could have a lot of stuff um, about. She had a very rich life. We didn't get to cover, there are some things we didn't get to cover about her, like too in depth. She was a founding member of the IWW. Um, you know, uh, worked with obviously she worked with the United Mine Workers of America her whole life. There's so many things that you could go into with Mother Jones. You could absolutely have a whole book about her. Like, like Paul did a book just about Eugene V. Debs. You could absolutely have a whole book about her. There's no plan right now. I think that if we were going to do, another Union book in the immediate, we've talked about doing the Haymarket Affair as a graphic novel before, but there's no plans at the moment to do anything more with Mother Jones. But it's a great one to do.
Yeah, I think it would be really cool. She's a wonderful character.
There's at least two Mother Jones reenactors, right, Kenzie? I feel like this happens. There's some plays. There's one woman that we've done some work with who's traveled out and been Mother Jones, like at the Blair Mountain Centennial, for example. So she comes in the dress, and as a good reenactor is, she won't break character the whole time that she's hanging
Right.
out. So I've forgotten her name. Kenzie, do you know off the top of your head?
You asked me
I'm
to
Yeah,
say,
I'm sorry, I'm terrible at names, but
But
yeah,
she
Mother
doesn't break character. She like stays in character when you're talking to her.
Well,
the
that's
whole time.
That's awesome. That's so
Irish
cool.
accent and
That's
everything. Yeah.
great. Oh
wow.
my God.
Swearing like a sailor.
Yeah, that's great.
That's really cool.
There's another question here uh, about tours in the area, and it looks like there was one that was booked in 2013 that it was a 3-day Lion Wars tour. And I would bet that uh, this was Doug Eastup and Coal Country Tours. So there was, there was this historian that would um, take people around on a charter bus and to Blair Mountain, to Matewan, to the Beckley Exhibition coal mine, and tell these stories. Unfortunately, that has come to a pause since COVID. He would do it every year, but there are opportunities to, beyond the museum to like go on a tour. So as Shaun mentioned, um, for special events, we'll do Matewan walking tours, and this year we're going to try to do monthly Matewan walking tours with one of our volunteers, and take people around to sites that are sort of unseen unless you have someone talking to you about them. Additionally, Shaun and I are working on a huge mandate to build the country's largest labor history trail. So we have a project that will follow the footsteps of the miners who marched in 1921. If you go to Blair Mountain today, I always tell folks if you blink, you'll miss it, because there's only one marker at the foot of this mountain where the largest armed labor uprising happened that commemorates that event. And so we're really interested in making these spaces visible and working with communities and people within those communities to do that and to regenerate conversations about working class history in these communities. So hopefully in the next 3 years we will have this trail completed, and it will be sort of a choose your own adventure setup where you could start in Charleston or start in Matewan and go to some of these places that are outlined in the book and also very important even today. People still live in a lot of these communities and work in a lot of these communities. And yeah, Shaun, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just to say it's what the trail is. So we did a project in 2022 with a group called Monument Lab, where we built sort of the phase one of what Kenzie's talking about. And when we say trail or route, we're talking actually about the march route that the miners took from the town of Marmet near Charleston all the way down to Blair Mountain, which is a 50-mile route. And so we worked in a community, the community Marmet, and then a community called Clothier, which is pretty close to Blair. And we created interpretive panels like you would see, at any state or national park or whatever, where you can like sit and read about what happened here. But then we also created these sculptural monuments with the community members, using the red bandana actually as a signifier on these silhouettes that we ended up creating the silhouettes with people from the communities who we did a photo shoot with them with all of these props and stuff like that. And they ended up, their silhouettes became these kind of cut steel monuments basically for that. And that all came from just, we've been hearing for years, like there's nothing on the landscape. Like it's cool that there's a museum, but there's this whole landscape that's just been hit by coal, for years and years. I, for example, got involved in the museum through the anti-mountaintop removal movement. So this is like, heavy strip mining, which has changed the way that the land is and the way that the land looks. And yet this history is actually kind of physically being removed from it. Right. Like I brought up trespass earlier and the need to kind of do archaeological work in these spaces. So the monument work is our kind of like pushing the museum back out into the landscape in that way, partially through these direct education. Like Kenzie said, you can kind of choose where you go, choose your own adventure, read about what happened here. And also that you can see these kind of like bringing artists into the conversation to do murals and to do other more creative things in those spaces. The town of Blair is just almost non-existent at this point, which is pretty wild because, like Kenzie said, that's where everybody wants to go, and it's mostly owned by coal companies now that own parcels through land holdings and whatnot.
Mm.
So we're trying to change that, but we're not necessarily like flush to the point where we could just like go buy a bunch of land. We're still a pretty grassroots effort.
That's a cool idea.
We've got a question from Barbara. She said that she spent the first 5 years of her life in Matewan, and then they had to move to the steel mill area of Ohio. She'd love to come see the museum, but she lives in England now, and thanks us for presenting this special history. She wants to know if it's at all possible to research her grandfather, Charles Price, on a link to the museum. She knows very little of his life other than that he came from Wells, a coal mining area, to Kentucky, then to Logan County, and then to Red Jacket, which we're very familiar with. Shaun, what advice would you have for Barbara?
I'm bad at the genealogical research, actually. It's not a great one for me, but we do get these kind of requests a lot. I mean, I think that it's difficult if somebody drops off the map like Dan Chain did, for example, at any point, because then we sort of lose our ability to pick up the historical record unless we meet a family member. Yeah, I mean, we do have some people on staff that have. It's always good to ask because we do have some people on staff who could be like, "Oh yeah, like that guy shows up as an organizer in this other story," and so we can kind of link the connections. But um, I'm not sure.
I
Go
would
ahead.
say email us. I put this in the chat. Barbara, if you send us an email, and this is for anyone that's looking to get in touch, you can reach us at info, I-N-F-O, at wvminewars.org. Even if we don't have the information that you're looking for, like a lot of these counties, I know Logan County, for instance, has a very active genealogical society that meets every month. And we're connected with the public library system in Southern West Virginia and just a lot of history keepers generally. And so we might be able to put you in touch with somebody that could help. Um, and if folks are interested in just like staying in touch with the museum and learning more about these stories, go to our website. We have a newsletter that we send out once a month with stuff that we're up to and like cool odds and ends. Um, of this history. So subscribe and keep in touch with us.
You could even become a sustaining member of the museum after you buy Summer and Raymond's book and read that, and then pass it on to someone else who needs it.
Y'all, we are coming to the close on our time. This has been such an incredibly cool conversation. Just before we wrap, I'd love to hear. It was really great to hear about some of the projects that the museum is currently working on, and I'm curious if there are any other upcoming projects that folks want to shout out, or other ways to connect, particularly Summer and Raymond, with your work.
There's another, there's another book coming out called Partisans. It's a graphic history of anti-fascism. Summer did a great piece in that book. It's an anthology with some really great comic creators, like some of the most wonderful people who are working in comics. And you get to learn about the partisan anti-fascist movement all throughout Europe. And I'm pretty happy with the book that's coming out, and I think that people who are interested in anti-fascist history will connect with that book.
Yeah, the piece that I did in that is called The Hungarian Resistance, and I did it with a writer named Sander Feinberg, who is telling the story about his relatives that were in Hungary during the time of the resistance and the Nazi invasion. And it's was a really cool piece. And it's he's also got a Kickstarter, but I think his Kickstarter ended. But you could probably find he like sort of did his standalone version of that comic as well, if you wanted to look for that. And then we're also really excited to see the Partisans version because it's couldn't be more timely, really, to be making anti-fascist art. So we got those things going.
That looks like a great project. Really excited to have that at our bookstore. Anything else anybody wants to shout out before we wrap? Awesome. Y'all, it has been a huge pleasure. Thanks to everybody that joined us tonight. If you haven't already, definitely pick up a copy of Black Coal and Red Bandanas. It is fantastic. And I know I am personally planning a trip to the museum for this spring. I can't wait to visit it for the first time. So I hope to connect with y'all there.
Yes, thank you.
Come visit.
This has been
Have
wonderful.
a great night, y'all.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks everyone.
Take care.